you can have your opinions, but ultimately your opinions about how people learn don't outweigh the facts.
Is retrieval practice effective? And the answer to that really quickly, like yes it is, and we know from hundreds, probably thousands realistically, of other studies that that's always been the case. When they have hopefully performed well because they've done their retrieval practice, you've got to explicitly link their success to the retrieval practice that
Helping
they did.
them make that connection between the two,
Yeah.
right? And ultimately, if we do care about helping children learn, you have to know about retrieval practice, basically.
If you've done your GCSEs and you use rereading as a strategy and performed quite well, it's really difficult to convince people that actually a different strategy would be better.
Are you looking for brilliant CPD that is inspiring, illuminating and impactful? Well, Inner Drive's training is evidence-informed, engaging and makes a real difference. Whether it is in person at your training days or online through our Teachers CPD Academy, Inner Drive is transforming how schools and colleges do professional development. Email us at info@innerdrive.co.uk to take your staff training to the next level.
Hello and welcome to Inner Drive's Science of Learning podcast with me, Bradley Bush, the podcast where we'll discuss the latest and greatest cognitive science and educational studies. Because we believe that there's absolute gold and dynamite in the research, and if we can make it accessible and put in front of the right people, i.e. you, our lovely listeners and subscribers, it can be transformational in the lives of students. In each episode, we will talk about 3 studies. Some are seminal, some are recent, all are illuminating. When we uncover a key cognitive science principle, you will hear the principle ping. And when we discuss the nuance of application, you will hear the nuance noise, which today sounds something like this. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Jade Pearce, talking all things retrieval. Jade, welcome to the Science of Learning podcast.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here.
Thank you. I told you in prep for this that once you heard my intro, there was a 55% chance you wouldn't be able to take me seriously.
I feel like we were already there anyway, but
Yeah.
I loved your intro. Thought it was great.
Fantastic. Well, welcome to the pod. I guess for anyone listening for the first time, we should probably say we've done quite a bit of stuff, worked together in the past. We did our Spotlight series, where we talked about recent studies. You designed our CPD suite on the Academy, which is internal training PowerPoint presentations that schools can use themselves as part of their training. So obviously, I had to get you on the pod.
Yeah.
So talking about all things retrieval, I think there's not many people I know, you're going to be modest about this, but generally for me, there's not many people I know who I think know more about the research and the application of retrieval practice combined. I think usually people are either really good at knowing about research. A lot of people have brilliant day-to-day experience of applying stuff, but the combination of the two, for me, for you on retrieval, is unbelievable. I think it's the equivalent of me basically having Usain Bolt here and showing him a video of me doing the dad's race at sports day at my kids' school. So yeah, pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you so much. I will take those compliments.
Yeah, no pressure to live up to the expectation. Yeah. So we've got 3 studies to cover, which won't do retrieval practice justice. It's probably one of the most researched areas of cognitive science, but we chose 3 for a particular reason. Let's jump straight in with the first one. So the first study is by Rodiger and Karpicke in 2006. Probably one of the most seminal, I think, retrieval practice studies there is.
Yeah.
The reason I like this, the setup of the study is you have 3 conditions. So students either read their core text 4 times and then do their final exam. The second group read the core text 3 times. They then get given a retrieval type quiz and then they do their final exam. Whereas the last one, they do their core reading and they do 3 rounds of retrieval and then they do their final exam. And the reason I like this, it's one of the few studies that has both which leads to better learning, but also students' judgment of their learning. So we can compare the 2 side by side. And so the first 2 main findings for me, the first one being when they ask students essentially, do you think it helped you? Do you feel that doing your study sessions, how confident do you feel basically going into the final exam? And overwhelmingly, students reported they found the rereading they thought it helped them more
Yeah.
by a significant mile. So those who did 4 rounds of reading felt the most confident going into it. And yet, when they then compared a week later, and this is like the kicker in the study, a week later, when they compared how well the students actually do, you almost see this reversed trend. Those who did more retrieval, they did like 50% better than those who just did lots of rereading. So a real difference. And so we have these two different things of students not knowing or believing that retrieval practice helped them, and yet the results show it did. And that made quite a profound impact, I think, on me, because it kind of lends itself to 2 natural questions. The first being, where are the opportunities to weave this retrieval practice into people's day-to-day practice?
Yeah.
Because it made such a big difference. And 2, maybe it's not enough just for us to do it in our day-to-day practice. If students don't believe it's going to help them, then how do we actually go about helping them do this stuff independently? Because it's not enough just for us to do it ourselves.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts on that study?
So completely agree that it's a really seminal study, and it's actually a study that I refer to when I am introducing retrieval practice to teachers for the first time, because I think the findings are so clear-cut about the benefits of retrieval practice. In terms of your first question, which is how can we weave retrieval practice into our day-to-day practice? Well, first of all, obviously, this study shows the huge benefits of practice testing, and so absolutely solidifies that retrieval practice is something that we should be doing regularly in our lessons. I think we can do that in lots of different ways, and I think lots of ways are common across our schools now because of how far spread retrieval practice is. I would say we can do quizzes, and we often see do-nows or starter quizzes at the start of lessons, for example. I think that we can do retrieval practice on prerequisite knowledge. So if there's learning that we're going to use in this lesson that we've covered previously, we would ask pupils to retrieve that before maybe then reteaching and filling any gaps. And we can also ask pupils and support pupils to complete retrieval practice as homework or in preparation for tests that they might have by setting retrieval practice tasks. So I think there's lots of ways that we can weave it into our practice. I'm actually meeting with a school later today it's a primary school, and they've had a really interesting approach that I've helped them develop, and they've got what they call their retrieval practice curriculum. So they actually collapse their timetable for 2 days at the end of every term or half term, and they just do retrieval practice activities on those 2 days for stuff that the pupils have learned either that term and then going back to the previous term and previous year.
Which is interesting, because one of the questions I always get asked is there any indication of where's the balance between how much time we should spend teaching new stuff versus how much time do we spend retrieving? And most people usually ask me that in terms of a lesson. I don't often get people asking me that in terms of a curriculum or across a term.
Yeah. So I would say if you are bothering to teach something, it's because it's important and it's going to either be used in the future or it's really crucial knowledge that we want our children to know. And most of what we teach, we want our children, our pupils to know for the long term. We can't retrieve everything because you'd need double the amount of time. So I think part of the answer to that is really identifying the core knowledge, and that's what you retrieve. But I also think it's accepting that where you can slim down the taught curriculum, the new content curriculum, and therefore have time for retrieval so that it actually is learnt for the long term, that's probably a better approach. Doesn't really answer the question, I'm afraid, in terms of like proportion of time.
But maybe maybe there is no answer to that question.
Yeah,
like,
and I think
it just
really
depends.
And really different for subjects and maybe primary school to secondary school, how well pupils tend to retain new content, all those kind of things.
Sure. So in this paper, one of the things they talk about, when they talk about retrieval practice, they talk about the testing effect. Yeah. So it's an interesting phrase. I just want to kind of touch on it, if I may. So a lot of the research comes from researchers in America initially. I think there's lots of researchers all around the world now looking at retrieval practice. In America, a lot of the time, retrieval practice is it's a synonym for what they call the testing effect. Yeah. Right. I worry about the phrase sometimes because if you go into schools and you say, we need to do more testing, people tend to throw large objects at you a lot of the time. So I guess it's just important to acknowledge when they talk about the testing effect, if it's seen in the research like it's in this paper, it doesn't mean formal, judgmental, quite stress-inducing final assessments.
So we would say it's to do low-stakes retrieval practice, which essentially means that retrieval practice is for learning. It's not an assessment.
Yeah.
Tests where you're trying to assess how well a pupil has learned something
Yeah.
is a different thing to retrieval practice quiz, let's say, where you're trying to get them to recall something from memory. And that's where I do think the word testing is beneficial, because it's obvious that it has to be from memory.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's a common mistake that can be made when we're doing retrieval practice. We sometimes allow students to look at notes or refer to a display, and then they're actually not using their long-term memory. They're not recalling that content, so they don't actually benefit from the testing effect. So I think it's helpful for that. But no, it absolutely does not mean that it has to be high stakes. So for example, low stakes, we would say, don't record scores.
Yeah.
Don't get pupils to say, oh, I got 5, I got 10, etc. We're just doing the test, so you've actually done the recall, the quiz or whatever it is. So you've done the recall. It doesn't really matter what you got. It's the process of doing it that is important.
So on that note, if you say one of the reasons you like the phrase testing effective, it puts its emphasis on memory, is probably good to acknowledge like a clear definition of retrieval practice. So I would always go for generating information from memory would probably be like I don't know how many words it is, 5 odd words. We can rewind and count that. That would probably be my definition of retrieval practice. So as I say, you can't look it up.
Yeah.
And that part from memory is the key point, is by having to recall it from memory, it strengthens and solidifies that memory trace.
Exactly, yeah.
So now that we've clarified what the testing effect is, I wanted to read you a quote from the study and then offer an opinion that I think is 30% controversial, and you can tell me if I'm right or not. So the quote from the study, they said, talking about the testing effect, they say, testing is a powerful means of improving learning, not just assessing it.
Yeah.
Right? And when I kind of came across that quote initially, it was a bit of a light bulb moment because, and here's my somewhat controversial opinion, I think for years and years and years, educators have got questioning and quizzing and testing the wrong way round. So I think for years you do a lot of learning and at the end you do a quiz to assess how much you've learned. Whereas this is saying the quiz doesn't just assess the learning, it accelerates the learning. Like the quiz is part of the learning process.
Yeah.
And therefore, when you start seeing it as it's not just something we do to assess learning, it does change how you view certain activities and even classroom structure. Because you go, well, in that case, where are the opportunities to get students doing this quizzing throughout the learning, not just at the end of the learning episode?
Yeah, and I would almost see them as discrete things. I would almost see the end of topic test or your end of term test, whatever it is, as that's your test. That is where we are going to make a judgment about how effectively the curriculum's been taught and therefore learned.
Yeah.
And I would see retrieval practice as an ongoing technique in order to improve the memory of the content you are learning or have learned previously so that you perform better in those tests.
Right, yeah. So let's go back to my earlier question then. So we talked about how we can weave it into our day-to-day practice.
Yeah.
The fact that students overwhelmingly felt that rereading was better. I think it gives them this false confidence. You never have to confront what you do or don't know.
Yeah.
And you can confuse and you can go, this many pages that I've read equals that same amount of learning. But of course the two aren't the same. How do we, I guess my two-part question is, how do we then go about helping students do this more? And the second part is, especially for the younger students, do we then have to also consider upskilling parents and caregivers? And is it the school's role to do that? Because it's what happens outside of the school. Or actually, do schools have a somewhat moral responsibility to, if you serve the community, to upskill parents and actually say, this is what we want you doing at home as well? Yeah,
okay. So I'll answer the first part first. So I would say, first of all, that this is a finding that has been replicated numerous times in studies, that pupils, and not even just younger pupils, people who are doing degrees, who have gone through GCSEs and A-levels and have done, copious amounts of revision, often feel that strategies such as rereading are more effective than those strategies such as retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving,
and they might even be quite successful, like in spite of that.
Issue.
Right.
So that's one of the issues that you've got to overcome. If you've done your GCSEs and you use rereading as a strategy and performed quite well, it's really difficult to convince people that actually a different strategy would be better.
Yeah.
So there's a few ways that I think that we can do it. The first is really explicitly teaching our pupils about memory and how their memories actually work, and therefore the strategies that are effective, and showing them the evidence and showing them the proof. So this is your working memory, this is your long-term memory.
Yeah.
This is how we get information from the long-term memory to the working memory. We do that through retrieval practice. This is the impact of retrieval practice. These are some of the studies that have been done, obviously in a simplified way.
So you would share some of those studies with students,
yes. And if I was introducing it to teachers, parents or students, refer to specific studies like this one and say, look, we had a group of students who just reread. And yes, immediately afterwards, they did remember more.
Yeah.
But we also had a group of students who did one test or 3 practice tests. And after a week, they performed much, much, much more highly. And how long do you actually want to remember your GCSE or A-level content for? A day or a week or a month? And so obviously, therefore, retrieval practice is going to be effective. That's the first step, I think.
And just on that note, I know that you probably have multi-steps, but on that note, one of the things I often see people who advocate for cognitive science or science of learning almost be accused of is this is a way of helping students just do well in their tests.
Okay.
Which is interesting because actually I think the opposite is true. Cognitive science and something like retrieval practice, we're not really that interested in short-term performance.
Yes.
Like I want large bodies of knowledge that you can access for long periods of time, as well as a love of learning.
Yeah.
Whereas if I just was caring about just the test, you do the stuff that works just in the short term.
Yes.
And that's not the case here, right?
I would say 2 things on that. I would say, do I want pupils to do well in tests, especially high stakes tests that are going to give them more opportunities in the future? Yes, absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
I don't want that exclusively at the expense of everything else that we know school does. But yeah, I do want my pupils to do well in GCSEs, A-levels, etc. And secondly, I would say that I completely agree. When we are trying to get students to use these strategies, it's because we think this content is actually really important for you to know as an adult or to help you in future study if you choose to study the subject going forward. And therefore, we really want you to remember it for the long term.
Okay, so you've done my first part with me interrupting you a million times on your way to your answer. What was the second part of your answer for my earlier question?
So then we've got to give pupils opportunities to do retrieval practice. And this can be in lessons, starter quizzes, etc., or it can be as homework, or it can be as a run-up to a summative test. So instead of saying, oh, you've got your test a week tomorrow, your homework is to do some revision, you set really clear retrieval practice tests and say to pupils, you've got to do them from memory. It might be a mind map, it might be answering quiz questions, it might be making flashcards and going through them, whatever it is. But you set tasks that they have to do the retrieval practice.
Yeah.
So that's the second step. So they've actually done it where they might not have if you'd have given them the choice.
So basically, it's like scaffolding, the same way you might scaffold any bit of knowledge. You're doing the same thing. So it's quite explicit and clear and structured to start with.
And I would say the tighter you can be to start off with, the better. So not do some retrieval practice this weekend. Yeah. This is the task that I want you to complete. Step 1 is to do it from memory. Step 2, look up anything you didn't know. Yeah. And then go over it again, and then maybe have another go. So really, really explicit, tight tasks. Yeah. And then when they have hopefully performed well because they've done their retrieval practice, you've got to explicitly link their success to the retrieval practice that
helping
they did.
Them make that connection between the two, right?
Yeah, and look, you can almost compare it as well. When you were doing rereading as a strategy, your revision strategy, or making notes and highlighting, other things as well that we know that students do that make them feel fluent with the material. These are the test scores that you were getting. Now that you've started doing retrieval practice, and we've done multiple repeats of retrieval practice, these are the scores that you're getting. And this is the reason why those scores have increased. So you've got to help them to attribute the success to the retrieval practice that they've been doing.
Makes perfect sense. Let's go on to study 2, just because study 2 is quite a big one. And I feel whenever I need to find a particular study on retrieval practice or find up a particular finding, this study tends to be one that I often refer back to.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think it's one that you've spoken about quite a bit as well. So why don't you talk us through why you chose study 2 on retrieval practice?
Yeah, so I led this study. It's what we call a meta-analysis, which is essentially when the authors, the researchers, have combined the findings of lots and lots of other studies. And I think it was 222 other studies that they combined and said, right, what are the average findings of all of these studies? Yeah. Obviously, that's great for us because it means you're getting a much larger data set. And also in this study, it was from lots of age ranges. It was studies that had been done in labs, but lots of studies that had also taken place in schools, so obviously more realistic. It was across lots of different subjects. So a huge amount of data. And then the other reason that I love this study is because it goes beyond the initial studies on retrieval practice, which looked at, is retrieval practice an effective strategy to use? It does cover that, but it basically says that, but we already know that now.
Yeah, like that war has been won.
Yes, exactly that.
It's always nice to have new
research.
studies, but it's not revolutionary.
Yeah.
And you're right, it is huge, this study.
Yes.
So it was done a few years ago by Yang and colleagues in 2020. I think it might be the most comprehensive
I think
study
so.
on retrieval practice that I've come across.
Yeah, me too, definitely. And I think it was nearly 50,000 participants, like in total across all of the studies that had been covered. Huge.
Okay, so what did they find?
So they do say, is retrieval practice effective? And they answer that really quickly, like, yes, it is. And we know from hundreds, probably thousands, realistically, of other studies that that's always been the case. But then it goes into much more depth, and it goes into, okay, so we know it's effective, but what implementation is most effective?
Right.
And I think that is where cognitive science research now needs to be. Not is spacing effective, or is interleaving effective, or whatever strategy that we're looking at, because we know that now.
Yeah.
But actually, under what conditions do these strategies have the biggest impact on learning? Like, how can we use them most effectively?
Nice, yeah.
And essentially, that's what this study looked at. So, for example, it looked at, does format matter? I get asked this a lot about retrieval practice. Like, should it be a multiple choice quiz, or should it be something generative like a mind map, or should it be short answers?
So Jade, does format matter? Should it be multiple choice quiz or mind maps, or what did they say?
In this study, the answer was no. Format doesn't matter, and the benefits of retrieval practice are found across multiple formats. So you can do multiple choice quizzes, you can do matching exercises, you can do short answer questions, and all of those things will be effective. And actually, I'm going to quickly highlight, if it's okay, another study that I love here. So this is the Pujar Agarwal study. And it was about Bloom's taxonomy. Like, don't let that put you off. Bloom's taxonomy and retrieval practice. And it looked at whether retrieval practice should just concentrate on factual knowledge, or it should also concentrate on higher order thinking.
Because that's one of the objections I hear a lot of time in some teachers in some subjects. They go, we focus less on isolated facts or knowledge.
Yeah.
We do higher order stuff.
So, retrieval practice is just rote learning.
Yep.
You don't care about understanding. Where actually, in this study, some pupils or participants just did retrieval practice on factual content.
Yeah.
Some did it just on higher order skills, I suppose.
Yeah.
And then some did it on a combination. And what the study found is that in order to improve your pupils' ability to complete higher order thinking skills from memory, so analysing, comparing, contrasting, evaluating, all those things that we really want our pupils to be able to do, you can't just do factual recall. You have to do recall, retrieval practice. That includes those higher order skills. And so I would kind of agree with the study. Format doesn't matter. You can use multiple choice questions, you can use short answer, but it does if you're trying to achieve or improve pupils' ability to both retrieve factual content and to use that content to think in a higher way about the material.
Sure. So the reason, so I like it, that this idea that like it's not just for isolated facts. I'll tell you why I quite like the finding that the format, it works across a range of formats, is probably how I'd phrase it. Because I quite like that is, I actually think that's quite empowering and quite liberating for a lot of teachers, because it's basically saying, you know your students, you know your subject or topic the most.
Yep.
Retrieval practice can be applied in a range of ways. You don't just have to do it one way.
Yeah.
And so actually, it then plays into that, you are the best place to make that judgment call because you know your subject.
Absolutely.
As opposed to, it only has to be multiple choice, so therefore you have to do multiple choice in every lesson, in every topic. It's sort of saying that at all.
And one of the things I always say about retrieval practice is it should look different for pupils of different ages in different subjects for different content. So, for example, we know for our younger pupils, we should probably do more scaffolding of our retrieval practice. It should probably be more closed and maybe should concentrate on factual content.
Yeah.
We know that in practical subjects, let's say music or PE, is a 5-question quiz the most effective form of retrieval practice, or is a skills-based task? Like last week we did dribbling, we're going to practice our dribbling again. And you can remind me of the most important points from the lesson, but then you're actually going to do it as a physical practice as well. Surely that's got to be more beneficial than doing a 5-question kind of written quiz.
So just to push back then,
Yeah.
if it can look like such different formats
Yeah.
and delivered in different way, be it like verbal, written or physical demonstration, is there a risk that because it can be broad, people can just say anything is retrieval, and then it loses a common thread? I guess my question is, what would it have to be? What's the kind of key principle that you'd have to have, regardless of the format, regardless of nature, that still makes it
So I'd say two
effective?
things. Something that pupils have learnt previously, and they do whatever it is from memory.
Right.
So if you are reteaching how to dribble and then they're practicing it, that isn't retrieval practice. It's just practice, because you've essentially negated the need for them to retrieve how to do good dribbling from their long-term memory. If they are doing it from memory and having a go, using what they learned previously, that's retrieval practice.
Perfect. So from memory, and that's been previously taught.
Exactly.
Can't go far wrong. Go on. So they asked a whole bunch of other questions. We could probably spend this whole episode just going through, and there was like 19 or 20 questions that they asked and answered. What other kind of areas caught your eye?
Okay, so two others that I picked out is, should we offer corrective feedback? And the answer was yes, it significantly increases learning. So again, I think it's one of those things where we're not just doing retrieval practice, but we know that doing retrieval practice and then giving learners feedback on the correctness of that retrieval practice can really heighten the gains from that.
And were they saying retrieval without feedback is bad, or were they just saying retrieval with feedback is better, but there's still some value in retrieval without feedback?
Retrieval practice with feedback is better. And I think, just to clarify here, what I'm not suggesting, we spoke about the time issue earlier, is that we have to spend loads of time doing the retrieval practice, then go through every single question. We'd certainly want what my school's now called select and neglect, which is you go through the questions that pupils have struggled with, and you kind of look at misconceptions and correct those. The questions that pupils got right, you can just say everyone got question 1 right, so we don't need to go through that.
Fine. Okay, so that was one finding. What was your second one?
And the second one was, do the number of tests matter? Do the number of retrieval practice episodes matter? And the answer was yes. Higher number of tests, essentially, higher learning gains, so that positive correlation. And I think that shows us the importance of that repeated retrieval practice. We can't just retrieve the content once and say like, oh, tick, we've done the retrieval practice there. If we want students to remember content for the long term, and the longer we want them to remember it for, the more retrieval practice we would have to do.
Which is interesting, because then you're starting getting into areas where you're talking about retrieval plus spacing.
Yes,
for
exactly
example.
that.
So my metaphor, because that was one of the findings that caught my eye. My metaphor, see what you think of this, is I equate it to walking through a field of long grass.
Okay.
Each time you do that walk, the path becomes a bit more defined and a bit more secure and structured, which is, I think, not a bad metaphor for memory tracers. Is so you have to do this stuff repeatedly, and I guess the natural conclusion for that for me is retrieval practice is not a one-off intervention, and yet sometimes I see it applied in that way of it allows us to tick the box and go, retrieval practice happened there, and so it's done. Whereas actually what this is saying is it should be this ongoing, weaved in throughout at times, as opposed to, yes, we've done that thing, that's the retrieval worksheet or the retrieval quiz, and therefore I've done my retrieval. Yeah,
exactly that. I always say we would never not have a taught curriculum, as in we would never map what we were going to, we would never not map, what we were going to teach our pupils, the content that we're going to teach our pupils. So why would we not map what we were going to retrieve, when we were going to retrieve it, and make sure that we're retrieving everything that's really important in the time allowed, and that we have got that repeated and spaced out throughout the year or course or however long you're thinking about.
So let me finish this study with one quote from the researchers. See what you think about this. It's quite a punchy quote in terms of as punchy as researchers can be. I sometimes like it when they get just a little bit sassy or a little bit almost passive aggressive in what they're saying. So see what you think about this. One of their kind of concluding quotes was, although testing has been met with occasional skepticism and criticism, these objections do not outweigh the extensive merits of frequent testing, which basically is saying you can have your opinions, But ultimately, your opinions about how people learn don't outweigh the facts. And it's a real, for me, as much as researchers can, kind of call to arms of saying the point of being evidence informed is everything is up for grabs.
Yeah.
And you have to be open to changing your mind and challenging preconceived notions about how people learn. And I think because retrieval practice doesn't sound very glamorous, it doesn't need to come with expensive kit like iPads all the time. It doesn't often sound sexy and appealing.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost sounds, you hear it being equated to rote learning.
Mm-hmm.
So rote learning sometimes means, are they just bored? Or is it disconnected from other bits of knowledge, which isn't what retrieval's about? And ultimately, if we do care about helping children learn, you have to know about retrieval practice, basically.
Yes, so I think if you look at the quote really positively,
Yeah.
you can see it as the gains and the benefits from retrieval practice and the strength of the evidence that sit behind it are so strong that where we know there are concerns or barriers, and we've spoken about some of them, time in classroom, maybe test anxiety, the strength of evidence is so strong that it's worth overcoming it, overcoming anything that would stop you from doing it.
And what's interesting, if we just touch on test anxiety, of course, there have been studies that found students who use retrieval practice tend to be less anxious
Yes.
about the test, because not only are we improving their confidence, you're improving their competence.
Yes.
So I see this with my kid with his spelling tests all the time. Might be nervous about the test at the start of the week. By doing a whole bunch of fun retrieval and flashcards and fill in the blank type letters, he's not worried about the test on Friday, because it's like, well, I know on Thursday and Wednesday I've been getting them all right because I've been learning.
Yeah.
And so it actually makes him less nervous about the test.
Completely
not
agree with
more.
that. I think most of the time, if you're nervous about a test, it's because you're worried that you won't do very well.
Yeah.
Or actually, if you've got evidence that suggests that you probably will do quite well, you're less anxious about it. I also think it's similar to the research on cold calling. If you never cold call and students never answer questions in your class, they will always be really anxious about answering questions in your class.
Because it's
They're
become
not
this
used
big
to it.
event.
Yeah, they're not used to it. It's not the norm. Or actually, if you from the start, you're gonna answer. Everyone's gonna answer questions in my class. I really care what everyone thinks. And you do cold call. After a few lessons, well, everyone's answered loads of questions. Some people don't know the answers sometimes. You've got a strategy for that. It's not a big deal anymore. So that anxiety fades.
Totally. And it would be remiss of me not to mention, we do have an episode coming up with Dr. Claire Badger talking about the research on cold calling. So I will ask her about that.
Amazing.
Let's do third and final study. A fairly recent study by Vaughan et al. Looking at, again, building on what you're saying, some of the kind of boundary conditions of retrieval practice. Not so much is it good or not, but like under what conditions and what ways can we make it most effective. So quite a clever setup for the study. They had students learn about bones in your body, like the names of different bones. And I think the reason I like this, I vividly remember having to do this in GCSE PE.
Yeah, me too.
When I was at school. Did you do PE at school?
Yeah.
For GCSE? Yeah, all the cool kids did.
And A level.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I did it for a degree. Anyway, so we talked, they got them to test, they had to learn these different bones in your body, so stuff like clavicle, sternum, metacarpal, those sort of things. And they had different conditions. So some of the students were able to get quite easy hints, was how they describe it.
Yep.
So an easy hint would be, I'll show you pretty much the whole word, but I'll only take away the vowels. And that's quite easy because you can actually work out a lot of the time what the bone will be, even if the vowels are missing. Some of the students had quite subtle hints. So, for example, instead of taking away the vowels, they took away the consonants, which is actually quite hard to guess what bones are on your body if you can't see most of the consonants on it. And some of them had no hints at all. So, just kind of guess the word. And the main findings that stood out for me, so they found not giving any hints was a bit better than giving some hints. But what I find really interesting, they looked at what happens if we make the hint too strong. Essentially, the question becomes too easy for the students. Here's the three main findings that they found. Number one, students rated the easy questions as the most fun. People love getting easy questions. They loved it in the study. Chances are anyone listening to the pod, your students love easy questions. You probably get the answer right quickly, probably get a nice little dopamine hit, feel a bit smug that you got it right so fast. Essentially the good times roll. So the students rated the easy questions as the most easy. Fascinatingly, they rated the easy questions as the most effective way to learn. So when they said, which one are you most likely to do again? They said, yeah, give me easy questions. And I think what the students are doing here, I think they're getting confused. I think they're getting confused with getting everything right with doing a lot of learning.
Yes.
But of course, the two aren't the same. You can get everything right by doing no learning whatsoever, essentially.
Yeah.
And then the kicker in the study comes, as is always the way in these sort of retrieval practice studies, those who did the easy questions remembered the least.
Yeah.
And this is an interesting challenge for us because you can see why people might be tempted to ask their students easy questions because the students enjoy them. The students honestly believe that this is going to help them. And it allows you to kind of tick that box of, we've done a bit of retrieval, we can move on quickly, essentially, and stick to the lesson plan. So I can see why people are tempted to ask the easy questions. Now, of course, I think there becomes a bit of a trade-off.
Yeah.
If the questions are too difficult and the success rate is too low, pretty soon that will lead to like demotivation and frustration. It's why I think Rosenstein put as one of their principles, obtain a high success rate. We know success fuels motivation. And I think for me, my reading of this study is the sweet spot. The kind of key underlying principle is our questions should be difficult but successful. Difficult enough to make people think hard, but successful enough of the time that it fuels their motivation. How does that sound to you?
So I completely agree. And I think that this is supported by the kind of theory around retrieval practice or other research around retrieval practice as well. But it's also, when you think about it, it is common sense.
Right.
So for example, if you have made the question so easy that pupils are almost given the answer, there's a bone in the leg and it starts with an F. Well, if you've done any work on the bones in the leg, you're going to know that is the femur.
Femur. Yeah, I was just about to say that. Yeah, definitely.
I panicked for a second that it wasn't the femur.
Don't, we would have just edited that out. That's
excellent.
fine.
So you haven't actually done any retrieval practice because you've basically been given the answer. And so therefore, you're not going to benefit from retrieval practice or the testing effect because you haven't actually done any.
Yeah.
So that kind of makes sense. On the flip side of that, and you said about the balance, if it is so hard that you sit there for 5 minutes and can't retrieve any of the answers because it was too long ago or, you didn't learn the content securely enough to start off with, again, that's just a waste of lesson time because you're sitting there or revision time because you're sitting there for 5 minutes and not doing any retrieval practice. You're not actually going to benefit from the retrieval practice. So there definitely is that sweet spot of it's challenging. So you're having to think hard about the content. You're having to process it.
Yeah.
This is where the Bjork's work on desirable difficulties would come in. If we make something more challenging, the impact on the long-term memory is stronger. It also links with the work on retrieval strength and on storage strength. It's a bit more complicated, but essentially we know that the retrieval strength of the memory is how easy you can recall it.
Yeah.
So if you've just learnt something, the retrieval strength is really high. You're not having to work very hard to retrieve that content from your memory. If retrieval strength is really high, though, when you do retrieve that content, it makes less difference to what we call storage strength, which is how strongly that memory is actually stored in the long-term memory.
Yeah.
So if it's easy, it makes less difference to the long-term memory in the long run, essentially. So it matches all that research. So you can see straight away, that would actually be true. So definitely we want to make the retrieval practice challenging, but we don't want to tip over into it's so challenging that the pupils can't do the retrieval practice because, again, that wouldn't benefit them either.
Okay, so let me ask you the very obvious, awkward question that this then raises. If I'm teaching someone one-on-one like a tutor, once I work out what your level or sweet spot is, I can tailor my questions perfectly to be this difficult but successful.
Yeah.
In a class of 30 with large range of prior knowledge, with different levels of learning challenges, it's easy to say difficult but successful is the sweet spot. Is that even possible with so many different students in front of you in terms of the question you ask to capture that for all those students?
Yeah, so essentially it's tricky. Yeah. And again, it's where we rely on teachers' judgment and teachers' expertise and teachers' knowledge of their content and their pupils. So I think there are some criteria that you can go by. So for example, we could say that retrieval practice is going to be more difficult if the initial learning wasn't that secure. Like they struggled, you got to the end of the topic and you thought, I'm not really sure, there's some gaps there. If the material is really complex, obviously more difficult to remember all that complexity in the long run. If your pupils' long-term memories aren't great, like if you've got a class who struggle with long-term memory. So there's those conditions where you can think, actually, I think they're going to find this retrieval practice hard. I'm going to give some more hints here. Obviously, conversely, if you think, no, they remembered it really well, it's pretty simple, we didn't do it that long ago, etc., you can think, actually, I'm going to make the retrieval practice quite challenging. So definitely use your judgment. And even though that's quite tricky, I think that the way in which to mitigate that is quite simple. Right. So I would say you start off with no hints.
Yeah.
And you let pupils have a go, unless you are absolutely convinced that they really need hints to start off with. But generally, we write our questions and we don't give hints. And then we circulate. And if it becomes obvious that the whole class are struggling, you provide hints at a class level. So you might say, right, everybody's struggling with question 1. Your hint is that the answer starts with a H or whatever the appropriate prompt would be.
Yeah.
Or it might be that you provide those hints on an individual level. So you just go up to the pupil and where they're trying to answer question 1, you just write H. Yeah. You don't have to say anything verbally because then obviously everyone else would hear you and maybe some pupils don't need that level of hint. But just for that pupil, you can give them a quick hint.
And so is what you're describing there, in a nutshell, the difference between differentiation and adaptive teaching? Because one could look at this study and go, because it has to be difficult but successful, I should preset different levels of questions to my students in advance, which is kind of like differentiation on steroids, basically, and probably is unobtainable in terms of workload requirements, versus what you were describing, which is, I'm guessing this more teaching to the top, start with high standards and adapt accordingly, which I imagine is a foundation of what a lot of people are looking at now in terms of adaptive teaching.
Yes, when we look at adaptive teaching, is exactly that. You pre-plan in advance what you think you will do in the lesson if needed.
Right.
So if the pupils really struggle with this retrieval practice, these are the hints that I'm going to provide. And you might have different levels of hints. Like, first of all, I'm going to start off with this like modest hint, and then if they're still really struggling, I can provide this more in-depth hint. And then you provide that adaptively if the evidence that you gather in the classroom says that it is needed.
Yeah. And you're far too modest to say it, but you've written a book on this.
I have just released my book on adaptive teaching with Inner Drive as part of their series. So I'm really looking forward to people getting their hands on that, and then they can give us some feedback on the retrieval practice chapter.
That was your hint to say the title of the book so people can find it.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, I'm really rubbish at this kind of thing. It is called Demystifying Adaptive Teaching.
Yeah, and I think you have a whole section on retrieval practice in there, which kind of goes into some of these studies and looks at that, because I think it's one of those things, it's become very popular. I think it's very difficult to do well, but if people have a bit of a framework on how to do it, it seems a lot less daunting, actually.
Yeah, hopefully. I think that people are scared about adaptive teaching because they feel like it has to be done live in the lesson. I've got to make these really complex decisions and do a new explanation or provide some new questions in advance. But actually you don't. You plan it all in advance, or at least think about it in advance so you've got it in your consciousness, and then you just decide if you're going to enact those plans in the lesson or not. So hopefully a concrete approach, but also concrete strategies that you can use if you do need to make those adaptations.
Amazing. Jade, thank you so much for coming on the pod. I could probably talk to you about retrieval practice all day, every day, but alas, time has run away from us. For everyone listening, please do let us know what you think of the pod. Please do like, comment. I'd love people if they got in touch to share their favourite retrieval practice study. Please do remember to subscribe, and if you are so inclined, give us a 5-star rating. To everyone who has already done so, thank you so much. It makes the world of difference. Jade, thank you once again. Everyone else, see you on the next edition of The Science of Learning. Bye!
If you've enjoyed this episode and want to improve your staff's understanding of the science of learning, you'd simply love Inner Drive's training. We offer brilliant in-person workshops plus online support through the Teachers CPD Academy, trusted by thousands of teachers worldwide. Simply email us now at info@innerdrive.co.uk to take your staff's professional development to the next level.